So far we've studied the arch and the tinted arch pattern, and in doing that we tried to find them in an array of different fingerprint patterns. In this process we used definitions and a number of analogies. And the first analogy that we used was the ride the bike. And if you ride the bike over the hill without getting a flat tire, then it was a plain arch. On the bike ride, we went to the camping site, and we discovered that the tinted arch and the camping tent, that is a good analogy in that we were looking at the ridges that held up the tent and called attention to the tinted arch. The process is going to continue as we move on to what I refer to as the Delta Lake Tour. And here we're going to fly over a lake in a hot air balloon. And in this process we're going to study the shoreline of the lake on both sides of the shore, and discover the phenomena of a delta. And a delta is formed from the water running from the river, and when silt builds up as it opens into the lake, this is called the delta formation. So we have shorelines and a delta formation. To further understand the analogy, let's extend that to the loop pattern. And here the analogy continues, except for we'll use the word type lines instead of shoreline, and we'll still use the term delta, only this is the loop delta and this is the lake delta. Let's see how well the analogy works with the loop, and I'm going to begin by just highlighting the type lines. And in the case of a lake, this would be the shoreline. Okay, so the shoreline is going to go in this approximate direction here. That is one shoreline, or in the fingerprint nomenclature, that would be a type line. This is the type line. And the second type line would be, I'm going to run along here and curve this. Well, let me do that over again because I wasn't real good on that curve. All right, let's see. I'm going to curve this. Okay, that's a little better. And then I drop down. All right. What I have defined is the type lines of the loop, and let's just use a yellow coloration for the delta, and that would be this area right here. And I'll just touch that. And now you can see the analogy, and this is a very good analogy. Again, the shoreline is the type line. The delta is formed from the silt, and it's at the inner location of what we refer to as type lines. And what this opens into, and I'll use another color, these looping ridges that start on one side, curve, recurve, and come back to the same side. Let's start here. It's starting to curve. Now it's recurving and it's coming back. You probably won't find the term recurve in the dictionary. It's just a fingerprint one. Let's do one more recurve. I'm following along, and there's my recurve, and it's coming back to the same side. Hopefully you recognize how outwardly different this is from the arch and the tinted arch. The other thing that you should pay very close attention to and always consider, and that is the direction of the ridges starting from one side, recurving and returning. It is dependent on, most of the time, whether it's from the right hand or the left hand. And let me just explain that by rotating it or flipping it horizontally. And now we have the same analogy that works perfectly well. It just is displaying the print in a different orientation, and it's coming from a completely different direction. I'm back to the analogy again, and I have the lake, and then I have my sketch or my hand rendering, and this is the actual fingerprint. Let's now consider this print as the exemplar, and just copy and paste it, and let's make another one. And I can just rotate it, in other words, flip horizontal. And now I have an exemplar of the same loop pattern. One could be originating from the right hand and one from the left hand. Let's revisit the arch pattern and make the comparison that these ridges start from one side, rise, and return lowered to the other side. They very conspicuously do not make a change or a loop, a recurve, and come back. And this is one of the most important comparisons that you'll have to look at. And also consider that the plain arch does not give any evidence as to possibly what hand it originated, either the right or the left hand, as the loop can. The loop pattern can give an indication if it came from the right or the left hand. The plain arch cannot. Let's also continue our comparison analysis and now compare the loop pattern to the tinted arch exemplars that we used. Recognize how in the tinted arch the ridges rise and return to the other side. In these examples here, this one, and this one, they rise very abruptly and make an upthrust, and we have what is referred to as the tent formation. In this one, very interestingly, this appears like it could be somewhat of a loop pattern where the ridges are coming in and making a recurve there. However, the difference is, and I can just make this larger. Let's compare these two now. The difference is there is a complete loop formation that is not obstructed, and it is a clear loop. Here, this pattern is coming up, it's squared off, and it has somewhat of a point and the angle that we discussed, and it's coming back. Now, that would be the distinction that you would have to make between these two patterns. And this is where the examination analysis has to be much more focused and careful, because actually you're just looking at this small area and trying to determine that it is not a looping formation. And here we understand and appreciate that classification often is a simple matter of process of elimination. As I continue with this loop description, let's just quickly review again and see if you can visualize through these graphics what I'm doing. If you were to only examine this much information, I would hope that you would think that that is beginning to be a plain arch pattern, because the ridges are rising from one side, rising and returning. Now, if I were to make a pattern where the ridges rise and tend to go up quicker and come back down, hopefully right away you're going to understand that I am going more towards the tented arch pattern here. And I have the upthrust and the ridges that are forming the tent. And I can put dots in there. That would be the tented arch pattern. Now I'm going to do something else. And hopefully you're already recognizing that this would be the loop formation. And if you remember, let's go over the type lines with red. This would be the type line, or the shoreline of the river. This one would be the shoreline, or the type line of the loop. And the delta formation is the first region just outside of where these two type lines diverge. And of course it always doesn't look conveniently like an actual delta, but sometimes it does. In the comparison of, or the examination of a loop, we are looking for these type lines and the delta formation. The type line is one component of the loop. Finding a delta is the second component. And the third component of the loop is a ridge that starts out on one side, rises, curves, recurves, and returns to the other side. And let me just, I'll put another one in here. It starts from one side, rises, curves, recurves, and now it's returning. To review again real quickly, type lines, delta, a looping ridge with a recurving structure with a clear recurve. That is the loop pattern. Let's just look at a few more exemplars of loop patterns, and you'll remember these two. This is the one where I copy pasted it and horizontally flipped it, and it represents possibly a loop from the left and the right hand. This would be another loop pattern. This is a loop. This is a loop. And this loop is extremely interesting because it illustrates the concept of what is the minimum qualifications for a loop. And it is, of course, if you remember, the type lines, which I'm designating here, and this one here. Now the delta formation is up here higher, and what is very important is you have a complete looping ridge that is, I'll trace it from here, coming around, circling back, recurving, and I have a very clearly defined looping ridge. And what's important is there is a space that I can count the ridges between what is the center of the loop, and I can count one looping ridge between the delta and this loop, or this core of the loop. This, in this small area here, is the minimum requirements of a loop, and it is considerably different than this print that has many looping ridges. This print here has multiple looping ridges, and the delta and type lines can be visible right here. This would be the delta, that little spot there, and this is the type line. In the comparison here, we can see that some loops may only have one looping ridge, some may have 15 or as many as 25 or even more sometimes. But the requirements are that there be at least one looping ridge. Now I think you're ready for a quiz, and not only are we going to look for the loop pattern, but you're also going to look for the plain arch, the arch pattern as represented here, and the tinted arch pattern. So when I bring up the print, I want you to determine whether it is an arch, a tinted arch, or a loop. First print. Second print. Arch, tinted arch, or loop. Third print. Let's be very careful with this one. And if I were to do this, what would you think it was? But that's not what you're seeing. This is what you see. So before you make judgment on that being a loop, consider the entire configuration here. Let me get this set. What about this? Arch, tinted arch, or loop. What about that? Okay. Well, there's a hint for you. Next one. arch, tinted arch, or loop. If at any time you need more time, you can just hit the pause or the scrubber pause and stop. Hopefully you'll remember the discussion we had on this one. Arch, tinted arch, or loop. Little hint there. That one looks interesting. Let's open that up a little bit more. Very interesting. You may have to guess on that one. Should be no guessing there. I want you to very carefully look at this one. Let's take this, open it up. Hopefully you're seeing what I see there, and you'll remember my talking about there only needs to be one looping ridge. Remember that? Okay. Here again, let me open it up. Hint, hint. Yeah, remember this one? Please immediately recognize that one. Ride your bike up and down the hill. That's a pretty big hint. Let's go to this one. You remember seeing that one before? Hint there. Okay. Here's one of our friends from earlier. What about that? What does that look like? Does that look like anything you've seen before? Hopefully not. about that one? Almost done. What about this one? All right. Before I conclude the loop program, I want to just explain one more very extremely rare loop pattern that you may see, and if you take my exams, you'll probably see one in the exam. If you'll remember, the plain arch pattern very characteristically starts on one side, rises, and returns to the other side. And this is apparent here in what we're seeing in this pattern. However, if you look a little bit more carefully at the top, we're seeing a different formation, and I'm going to designate that with yellow. And you may look here how it is starting on the right side, and it is curving, recurving, and it is returning to the right side. And this pattern, like I said, is very rare. This would still be considered a loop pattern. It has a combination of a plain arch and, of course, the looping ridge. And this loop will have this wave in the center where the plain arch is pushing it up. And I just wanted you to remember that, that loop. And in all likelihood, if you ever see one, it will probably originate, or more likely to originate, on the right or the left thumb. Just wanted to mention that, and you can be looking out for it. Let's review what we did. We went on a hot air balloon ride over a lake, and we recognized shorelines and the delta, which is formed from silt from the water running from the lake into the body of water, which was the lake. And we made the clear analogy between the lake and the loop fingerprint pattern, changing shorelines to type lines and maintaining the delta analogy. I then went into some considerable amount of explanation with paintbrush, and I color coded the shoreline and spoke about it being the type line, and this would be the other type line here. I'm following it along, and the delta formation is this little small ridge configuration right here. And the important concept of ridges starting from one side, remember, curving, recurving, and returning to the other side. And in this case, there were multiple ridges that came from one side, recurved, and returned. But I also discussed that you only needed to have one complete recurve or loop for it to be the minimum standard for a looping formation. Again, the loop has type lines, it has a delta, and it also has a ridge count from the delta across to the looping ridge, which is located right here. After that discussion, I displayed a number of prints, and your task was to identify them as an arch, a tented arch, or a loop pattern. And in many cases, of course, you may not have identified them to either of the patterns that we've already discussed. At this point, we have used the road test analogy to recognize plain arches. We use the camping tent analogy to recognize tented arches. And then we compared the lake to the loop pattern using shorelines and delta and type lines and the delta in this analogy. At this point right now, we have identified in this array of fingerprints arches, tinted arches, and loops, and we have one more pattern remaining. Before we move forward with the last pattern, of course, we have the exercises to complete, and you can examine your loop pattern recognition guide that has the analogies, definitions, and exemplars. And then you'll move forward to taking the array of patterns and determining which ones are loops. I just want you to put a capital L over the loop patterns and capital A over the plain arches and a capital T over the tinted arches. So review each one of the exemplars and identify them with the patterns that you have learned. Then you will be able to review a video and see what all the answers are.